Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the presidency of George H.W. Bush, who is able to succeed Ronald Reagan after having been his vice president. One of the first times that this had been achieved for some time. And so Bush comes to office in 1988. And once again you're going to see the same dichotomy. Success abroad, struggles at home. At home, Bush presents himself as a compassionate conservative, someone who holds conservative principles but isn't going to take unpopular actions like those Reagan had done to cut Social Security and Medicare programs, or at least reduce the funding to them. And he passes the Immigration Act of 1990, which increases the number of immigrant visas that the United States provided every year. On a conservative side, he attempts to avoid increasing taxes. But as the United States economy continues to struggle, in the end, he is forced to do so. He's forced to do so by difficult political circumstances, but it earns him the undying unpopularity among Republican voters, Republican congressmen, Republican senators, and this eventually, basically, in the end, will guarantee that he won't be reelected. In foreign policy, George H.W. Bush oversees the great American achievement of the second half of the 20th century, successful conclusion to the Cold War with the dismantling of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was increasingly struggling to stay compatible with the United States in the arms race that Reagan had established. They were caught up in a war in Afghanistan that was kind of the Russian equivalent of the American war in Vietnam. It was a war that they would never be able to win. Thousands of Russian soldiers were being wounded and killed, and eventually the Soviet Union has to pull out of Afghanistan, has to admit that they do not have the economic strength, they do not have the military strength to prevent other communist-led nations from overthrowing their communist governments. And as soon as this is clear, this happens all across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, all these countries that the communists had taken over after World War II, those communist governments are overthrown and new democratic governments are reinstated in their place. We see this happen most famously in Germany in 1989, when the Berlin Wall is finally brought down and the two Germanys, East and West Germany, are united together. Finally, even Russia itself sees the overthrow of the Communist Party. Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was criticized by communist hardliners for allowing the Soviet Union to fall apart and for allowing Russian military power to fall apart. And they demanded that he take back control of these countries that had been under communist rule. When Gorbachev refuses to do so, they try to overthrow him. However, this plot to get rid of Gorbachev was poorly planned and was unsuccessful. And a political leader within Russia, Boris Yeltsin, is able to overthrow the coup, the attempted overthrow, and re-establish control of Russia. But he does this with American help. He appeals to Bush to provide him with the support that he needs in order to re-establish control. And so after this, communist hardliners are thrown out and the Communist Party is removed from power in Russia. And so Bush has brought the Cold War, this titanic conflict that threatened to destroy the world between the United States and the Soviet Union, he has brought that to a successful close. And so now you enter into a new age. And this has sometimes been referred to as a new world order, in which instead of having these two huge superpowers competing with one another, but trying to avoid an all-out war, you now have one single superpower, the United States, and a lot of conflicts and rogue states around the globe, and there's this question mark as to how involved the United States should be. Should the United States continue its Cold War strategy of opposing dictatorial states, of opposing totalitarian regimes in the name of liberty, or should it take more of a backseat? At least during Bush's presidency, the answer is that the United States is going to continue to be involved around the world. And this is especially the case, most famously the case in the first Gulf War in 1991. in which an American-led coalition, so about 30 countries support the United States, but they would not probably have gone to war without American support and American leadership. They invade Iraq, which is led by Saddam Hussein. They invade Iraq in order to prevent his attempted occupation of Kuwait. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is to defend Kuwait. One is to prevent Saddam Hussein from gaining access to maybe about a fifth of the world's oil reserves. At least that was thought of at the time. But it shows that the United States is still playing a prominent role around the world, is still expected to play a prominent role around the world, even after the end of the Cold War. And some people might even say, especially after the end of the Cold War. And so this first Gulf War, great success for George H.W. Bush. The war is won very quickly with minimal American casualties, although Saddam Hussein still remains in power. Nevertheless, George H.W. Bush remains unpopular among the Republicans, in part because of his failure to resist pressure to raise taxes. And so in the 1992 election, he is defeated by the Democratic nominee Bill Clinton, who wins the presidency with only 43% of the popular vote, because there are two Republican candidates running, or two candidates who are both courting Republican votes. And so Bill Clinton becomes the first Democratic president since Jimmy Carter. What's interesting and what's significant as we come to the end of this week on the conservative revival is that Bill Clinton wins office as a very moderate Democrat, or as a very moderate liberal. Someone who supports reforming the welfare system, someone who supports the death penalty. And this is a sign of the success of the conservative revival in the 70s and the 80s, that the more progressive party, by the time we get to the early 90s, has to at least agree to some of these conservative positions in order to once again gain the presidency.